Welcome to session ANA 115. It's about SAP Data Warehouse Cloud open for integration. My name is Axel Meier, and I'm happy to walk you through the session. From the agenda perspective, I'm going to walk you through the topics of SAP Data Warehouse Cloud and SAP Cloud Platform from an overview perspective in terms of open for integration, following by the different scenarios using SQL data warehousing for integration, the data lake for integration, and also the SAP Web IDE for data integration. I'm also going to walk you through the user management settings you can find on the system. So let's get started. Let's take the first slide from an overview perspective in terms of integration. Data Warehouse Cloud is open for integration for SAC, like SAP Analytics Cloud, to consume the models we create in Data Warehouse Cloud. And when we talk about Data Warehouse Cloud in the first place, we'll talk about the big boxes in the middle of this slide. So we have connectors built into Data Warehouse Cloud. We have a way to model how we process the data using our data layer editors, which gets us the ability to either virtualize or persist the data. And we also have the ability to focus on the business user with a certain business layer, which is virtual only. Next to that, we have, in terms of openness, the ability to interact on a pure SQL level, like using so-called openSQL schemas. We also have the ability to interact using the HANA deployment infrastructure containers, which are specific to using the Web IDE in terms of the SAP integrated development environment. And we're also open for integration in the context of Data Warehouse Cloud from a HANA data lake perspective. So there's a lot of perspectives we put in terms of openness, and I'm happy to walk you through the next slides. This slide is about the context of SAP HANA for SQL in terms of integration. And within this aspect, we're focusing on the heavy SQL use cases. So if you're coming from an environment where you're just great on using your SQL, DDL, DML statements as an example, you're using your stored procedures to process the data, you're more than welcome to onboard this type of statements in the Data Warehouse Cloud environment here in the context of using the openSQL schemas. The openSQL schema comes up as a pre-configured schema from the Data Warehouse Cloud perspective. So we'll provide a host name, a port, a user, and a password to get you connected. And it's the same way as you would connect to any database. But in this case, we're pre-generating an openSQL schema from SQL Data Warehouse perspective, which easily integrates into Data Warehouse Cloud because you do not need to transform and process any data. Data Warehouse Cloud simply gets you the ability to access the artifacts you're building on your SQL schema. Again, any tool enabled to connect to HANA Cloud from the database perspective is invited to come in and process the data as you need. Of course, you also have the ability to access data models you create in Data Warehouse Cloud from the schema. So if you have a certain tool in place where you're building your models in Data Warehouse Cloud, like using the data layer editor as an example, you can also consume this type of models from the SQL perspective for further processing. And again, the tooling of choice, it's up to you. You can onboard your existing ETL loads to process the data and persist it in the openSQL schema tables. And again, the schema is pretty much like a database schema in the cloud, pre-configured, as I mentioned before already. And you can come in and run your DDL, DML statements using your SQL editor of choice. We also have a pre-configured Database Explorer tool available, which is the SAP offering for your SQL statements. Also, we're inviting any JDBC, ODBC tool capable to connect to HANA Cloud databases to come in and process your data. So we feel it's a very open environment. It's pre-configured. It's easy to go. You don't need to make yourself familiar with configuring databases, as this would be pre-generated by Data Warehouse Cloud. And you can decide how many database schemas you want to connect to and create from the Data Warehouse Cloud perspective. The next topic will be about the integration of the SAP HANA Data Lake. As you might know, HANA Cloud comes with the ability to connect to the SAP HANA Data Lake. And of course, we want to leverage the data lake as we position the data lake. So you have your own connectivity to bring in the content to the data lake. Again, you can create your own type of tables, anything you need in the context of the data lake. This is of type relational. It has its own connectivity, so you can bring in the data relevant for the data lake, which doesn't make sense to be loaded into the HANA Cloud environment. Like if you're interested to bring in IoT data or sensor data, you're more than welcome to bring the data to the HANA Data Lake environment using your tool of choice. And from a Data Warehouse Cloud perspective, we simply access the tables and artifacts on the data lake schemas from the openSQL environment, pretty much similar as I described on the previous slide. It's going to be separate, but we have a complete integration perspective from Data Warehouse Cloud. So we have the way to seamlessly access the artifacts and the content located in the schemas of the data lake without having a need to transition any data. So we're providing seamless access from Data Warehouse Cloud editors like the data layer to connect to the artifacts located in the HANA Data Lake environment. Last but not least, we're also open to integrate using our SAP Web IDE, which is the offering from SAP to model the HANA-specific artifacts like a HANA calculation view, the HANA flow graph, so everything enabled to be leveraged from the HANA platform perspective. You can leverage the Web IDE to access the Data Warehouse Cloud models as a source. You can decide how to model and process the data within the context of a Web IDE project. And once you build a project, we're generating something we call a HANA Deployment Infrastructure Container, an HDI container. And you can create one or multiple. There's no change on how you behave from a Web IDE perspective. It's the same environment, but the beauty on the integration with SAP Data Warehouse Cloud and also in terms of openness is that we, again, do have the ability from the data layer perspective to access the HDI container as it's fully integrated, not forcing you to move any data in that sense. So again, it's another level of openness we're providing within the integrated aspects of SAP Data Warehouse Cloud. As I try to highlight, we'll walk you through the different capabilities to onboard existing processes, existing tooling. We also invite you to write your own SQL code within Data Warehouse Cloud of the environment of SQL data warehousing using the HANA Data Lake to define the models you want to process and load the data to. And of course, we are also enabled SAP Web IDE to deploy the HDI containers into the environment of SAP Data Warehouse Cloud. It's important to mention that we're deploying for the HANA SQL case and for the HDI case to the same HANA Cloud database tenant. So there's no extra database required. We simply deploy to the same database tenant. Now, let's move over to the demo.
Welcome to this recording of SAP Data Warehouse Cloud focusing on the integration of the SAP Database Explorer with SAP Data Warehouse Cloud. The integration of the SAP Database Explorer is supporting the HANA SQL use case embedded with SAP Data Warehouse Cloud. I'm logged into a Data Warehouse Cloud tenant where I navigate down to the space management, where we do have the ability to configure the access to the Database Explorer. So let's drill down into the space management UI. And on the database access pattern, we'll drill down to the database user UI. Within the database user UI, we have a new look and feel focusing on the database user. But again, the database user is still assigned to a database schema, which we usually called an openSQL schema in the previous version of Data Warehouse Cloud, now focusing on the database user. Once you create a database user, you can specify the different privileges like data ingestion, data consumption, and also HDI consumption. Where in this case of my database user SQL_DB Explorer, I want to focus on the data ingestion and data consumption part. Again, data ingestion is related to have the ability to create your own tables, your own procedures, which is relevant for the HANA SQL use case. Data consumption by itself provides the ability to get access to the Data Warehouse Cloud consumable models, which can be also enabled on the space level by checking the default consumption of the space data. Again, for our DB Explorer user, like using the according database schema, we have data ingestion and data consumption enabled. Now, let's use the embedded Database Explorer to operate and navigate on the according database schema. I click on the Explorer and the according Database Explorer window is popping up. The according space gets assigned where once you log on the first time, you need to apply the according password, which is available from the space user UI information box. In my case, the database schema has been assigned from a previous step. Now, if you're operating on the Database Explorer, you do get the ability to operate on the full catalog of objects you have based on the database user creation privileges. Let's focus on the view section because I have two views available from the Data Warehouse Cloud perspective, which are classified for consumption, like for exposure. And once you click on the view section, we do have the different options, like the different ways to access the data. The Database Explorer schema is the schema relevant for data ingestion. Once you want to use the consumption part of the already deployed Data Warehouse Cloud models, you need to check also the data consumption part, which is a different schema. Once you selected the different schema and we're still on the view section, you do see the Data Warehouse Cloud views already deployed, which are ready for consumption. So once you want to run some simple statements, like running a simple select star, you can reuse the models for sharing, and you do have the ability to operate on an SQL, like on an HANA SQL level, working on the data, creating your own stored procedures, like running some max on weight measure. And once you run that, of course, you get access to the already configured data view, which gets access to some remote data sets to execute the according query. You can mix and match, and of course, you can also create your own tables. Like if you want to run some HANA SQL statements, like create a column table with a partitioning clause, as we're running on HANA SQL level, of course, you can create the table because we're running on a HANA Cloud database schema. Once you navigate on the table level, you do see the table you previously created. Of course, we're enabling the access for HANA SQL, and once you have a table created, you can also use an external tool, like a tool which is capable to connect to a HANA Cloud database schema, like an ETL tool, like Business Object Data Services, or further applications like SAP Data Intelligence to connect to the openSQL schema using the hostname, the port, the user, and the password. And they can push data into the structures of the table you're creating. So you do have the ability to integrate with existing tooling to push data or pull data from the openSQL schema, which at the very end gets you the ability to create your own SQL-based data warehouse system by reusing existing DDL or DML statements you probably are using in your HANA on-prem environment, or you need to migrate the non-HANA statements to become HANA SQL compatible. And you can come in and create the according DDL and DML statements, including stop procedures, to build up your data warehouse system, what you used to know from your non-SAP environment. Again, in terms of integration, I walked you through the steps to get access to the consumable models from a data warehouse cloud perspective, which becomes available to the Database Explorer. But of course, also if we use a table which has been created within the Database Explorer, you can now go back to Data Warehouse Cloud and reuse the table from the Data Warehouse Cloud graphical editor perspective. To do so, let's switch to the data builder, drill down to the views, and let's start a new graphical view. Let's focus on the source section. And as a quick reminder, we used to work on the SQL Database Explorer schema. And to do so, we used to create a table called sales items, which now becomes available for the graphical editors. Again, so this table has been created from the Database Explorer, like from the HANA SQL perspective. And once we load some data to the table, you would see also on the data preview how the data populates in. But of course, you can leverage the capabilities of the graphical view builder to connect to the table created in the schema SQL Database Explorer. And you can come in and mix and match this with existing tables you probably have already available. Like this is focusing on sales information, focusing on sales order ID and sales order item. So probably you're interested to run a quick join with data coming from a different environment. In this case, it's a view referring to a HANA database connection, like to a remote HANA database connection. And you can specify how the data should be joined and further processed. So again, the integration of the SAP Database Explorer provides you the ability to interact on a graphical UI using the SAP Database Explorer capabilities within the context of Data Warehouse Cloud. Thank you for watching.
There's more information available with related SAP TechEd sessions, as you can read them out on the slide. You also find additional information on the public SAP websites. We also invite you to continue your learning experience from SAP TechEd in 2020. Please deepen your learning experience from TechEd and also deepen and validate your sub-solution skills. You'll find the links on the slide. And this is the end of the session. I'd like to thank you for attending this session, and I'm looking forward to meet you in person. Thank you.